All right. So today we have my good friend Paco Nathan, founder of Derwin, which is a boutique consultancy focused on data and AI. And this is our monthly roundup of all things AI, data, and tech. So, Paco, welcome as usual to the Data Exchange podcast.
Thank you, Ben.
All right. So let me go first. Obviously, we have to do our monthly roundup of new foundation models. I guess the big one this month is Llama 3. Although Snowflake also came out with a model called Arctic. So those I would say are the ones that garnered the most news. Probably the more significant of the two models is Llama 3. And I've been using Llama 3 for maybe now 2 weeks, and I'm pretty happy. I mean, it's definitely it's better than Llama 2. Uh, how do I know that? Well, I know that from basically the usage that I've had in the last 2 weeks at least. The answers seem to be a lot more on target, and it also doesn't seem to require as much hints in the prompting stage, right? So for developers, this is good news because this is another sign that open models are at least continuing to improve and keep pace. Although obviously, uh, it would be fair to say that the best proprietary models are still better, right? So here we're talking about GPT-4, Gemini, latest Claude.
Yeah.
And you can see that from the LM chatbot arena, the rankings.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was going to bring that up.
The rankings there are quite clear. And so
Yeah.
I guess the other thing that is worth pointing out, and this is something I've raised here with you, Paco, before, is this whole notion of openness.
Yeah.
And I think people appreciate the fact that these models are open in the sense that the weights are open. If you read the license, most people can use it, right? For whatever commercial use they want. I think there's some limitations. You have to read the fine print, but increasingly, I think if you read the announcements, posts, and release notes, they reveal things, but only up to a point, right? So I think I tried my best. I don't know if you saw this, Paco. I put together like a short post on
Yeah.
architectural reveals in the latest announcements post. So you've got the usual things there. Like mixture of experts. I think is a big pattern. Group query attention is another big pattern.
Yeah.
But they don't. I think they now talk about more about the on the data front. They talk about how much data did we use, what's the context window, what are some at a high level, what are some of the tricks we use around tokenization to become more efficient and things like that. But there's not much reveal on the data side, right? So, I mean, I think people kind of a lot of these models probably overlap a lot on the data, but they don't really necessarily tell you what data they're using. And also, the other thing about data is that I think increasingly a lot of these teams set themselves apart from each other on what kinds of data tools they have, right? So, because the better your data tools in terms of uh, squeezing data quality, removing duplicates, removing bad data, the better your training process is, the better the model is. Maybe if you can remove, offensive things on your data set or IP protected content on your data set, uh, the better the end user experience is after the fact. But there's not much being revealed. So I guess TLDR, great for us that the models continue to improve. Great for us that the models are open at some level. I think what we would like is probably a little more transparency on the data front, particularly, and I would say more suppliers of open models because I mean, both Databricks and Snowflake have now released an open model, but this is the first. And obviously, they're focused on enterprise use cases like SQL and Python and things like that. But the question is, are they willing to update their models on a regular cadence? Because that's going to cost them money, right? So
Yeah.
Meta seems committed, but Meta seems to be the only one that is reliable, right? Mistral Large is no longer open.
Large.
Is no
Yeah.
longer open, right? So that's my monthly dump on the open LLM front. So I don't know if you have any reaction there.
Well, yeah, I'm curious. I mean, I think we could also probably put Microsoft's announcements into the mix as well as Apple. It does seem like if you roll the clock back a few months, all eyes were on OpenAI.
So
But now,
Paco, maybe you should at least at a high level describe these two announcements from Microsoft and Apple.
okay, yeah, just at a high level, Microsoft has well, I'll go to the Apple one first. Apple has OpenElm, and it's interesting. There's a paper out on Archive. It was on April 22nd, and they also have their models up on Hugging Face, and the CoreNet code that they use for training it is available on GitHub. And their paper makes a pretty big deal out of the openness of it and what they're trying to do. We can dig into this more, but Microsoft has, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Phi 3, and similarly, they're looking at smaller models. They're really touting this idea of in addition to what Meta said, also using DPO for safety alignment. So you're seeing a lot of these RLHF alternatives like DPO, SFT, et cetera, being used. And that one was published on April 23rd, like a day after Apple. So I think that we're seeing a lot of contenders now in this space. And what I was curious about asking you was, is this now like a six-way race where we've got, basically Microsoft plus OpenAI, but then Microsoft on its own, Microsoft doing deals with Apple and Cohere. We've also, like you say, we've got Databricks and Snowflake in the race. Meta's coming in strong with their offerings. So yeah, is it looking like more of a six-way race?
Well, I mean, I think that so on the large models that on the server side, right? So you've got the three commercial suppliers, right? So OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google.
Okay.
And then on the open side, you've got Llama, Meta, right? I think Databricks and Snowflake are TBD because they have to show that
Yeah.
they're willing to update more, and it's not a one-off, right? So then you're really talking about four on the server side. Now on the smaller models that are more on the phone level, I'm not as
Right.
familiar in terms of who's really the best there in terms of what developers are using. I know Llama folks are working hard to take Llama and run it on different kind of hardware, but I don't know how competitive each of those models are. Like the ones you mentioned, the Apple model. I mean, I don't know if it's competitive with whatever Google is going to put on their phone, right? So I would suspect that whatever Google has on their phone might be better, and that's not open, right? So.
Well, two other things come to mind. One is what was striking to me is just about the partnering. Like Meta is partnering with both Apple and Microsoft now, which is interesting because you're kind of seeing things spread across the industry, not as much. Maybe it's frenemy. I don't know if that's the right way to characterize it, but it seems like people are working with multiple different partners in this.
I think Microsoft is trying to work with everyone, right? So they now have
Yeah.
a partnership with Mistral, and then obviously OpenAI. I think part of it is, they have no choice because if something happens to OpenAI, they have nothing, right? So because they decided not to to do anything on their own. Whereas I think Google and Amazon, I think Amazon is also partnering with a bunch of folks, but I think also trying to do something on their own. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not up to date on what Amazon has on their own outside of the partners, right? So, but I suspect that they probably have some small model available, right? So, but
Yeah, they
I,
probably
I,
some, yeah.
yeah, I think on the larger question of open models, yeah, I don't know. I mean, so we have one on the server side, right? So Meta, right? So I think people tell me don't worry about it, but I don't know. Why shouldn't you worry if you have only one supplier?
Well, another thing that's coming out of this announcements from Meta about Llama 3, I was interested to see about the context window. It's like Gradient released a Llama 3. It's up on Hugging Face. It's the 8 billion model. And they were using rope to extend the context window or adjust it. So 160K. These context windows are really large. I mean, they're larger than like, major books that you know about.
Yeah. I mean, the Databricks context window out of the gate, I think, is pretty large, right? Because it's an enterprisey kind of. I think the idea is that by increasing the context window, I think they're saying that maybe you don't need to use RAG as often. But I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that yes, you can. And you can also do instruction tuning, right? So by providing examples, but then now you're packing the context window, the latency is high,
Yeah.
and yeah, I'm not sure exactly if uh that might be good for certain kind of ad hoc projects kind of thing, but when you have a lot of people using the system and each one is hitting the system with massive amounts of text. I don't know if that's a viable approach either. So you want something that's efficient, right? So
Yeah, it really gets into a lot of engineering trade-offs there and maybe arguably a lot of data engineering concerns you really have to take seriously. It does seem like instruction tuning is another thing that has been mentioned by most all these projects. I wanted to bring up one point though. There's been some discussion about multilingual training. I didn't know. Have you done any work like multilingual with Llama 3?
I think off the bat they're all pretty competent, but they're not specifically. They may not be specifically targeting certain languages, but
Yeah.
you can imagine the amount of data that they're using online, right? So they're pretty competent, but I wouldn't. If you wanted a language specific model, you may have to go to like a Chinese LLM or an Arabic LLM, right? So,
Yeah.
but off the bat, they can probably handle Chinese and Arabic, but maybe not to the level of those specific LLMs, right? So, yeah.
Great.
So anyway, off to you.
Okay, well, I'll follow up. I think that's a great segue. You mentioned about the LMSys. There's the Arena ELO. We can show the charts online. We can give some links. But there was a interesting quote that Max Lebon had posted, um, and a few points here, taking a look and saying that the gap between the best performing closed source and the best performing open source models, again, given how much those are accurate terms, but basically the gap is narrowing. And so the question that's been going around is maybe it's less discussion about GPT-4 replacing humans and more about can we replace GPT-4 uses with Llama 3? Um, and I've seen this phrase from a few different people, but definitely Max Levon and Danny Svaro and others. And it's interesting because the lag has really dropped rather than having years in between major models. Now we're seeing like 6 month So the cadence of these different models, the competition has been picking up, and it does appear when you kind of look at that cone in the ELO scores versus the release dates, it's very interesting. There's mostly up at the top, like you were mentioning before, you've got GPT-4, GPT-4 Turbo, but you've got Claude 3, Llama 3, Gemini Pro. Um, so are we within striking range now of where, like you say, Llama 3, hopefully there will be others that are effectively open, but are they within striking range of really giving GPT a run for its money?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that, but then that doesn't mean that you shouldn't ignore GPT-4, Claude, or Gemini either for prototyping and testing, right? So, I mean, but basically, I think that uh, you probably can build a lot of things now with Llama 3. For text at least, right? So because remember, Gemini is multimodal, right? So
Yeah,
some of these models are multimodal, but I think that you definitely can build with a lot of these models now with Gemini, with Llama 3, right? So whatever it is you want to build, particularly if you're going to fine tune with your own data, but I think take advantage of the commercial models for prototyping. I mean, I wouldn't uh, 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 kind of ignore them, particularly since they seem to be committed to releasing more updates, right? So,
interesting. Yeah.
like I said, Llama is good because we know Meta has a lot of money, so we know that's going to be updated, right? So the question is w- what about the other open models? We really literally have only one supplier. Now, people keep telling me I shouldn't worry, but we have one supplier and it's a company that we've gone down the road with this company before on other issues, right? So I don't like to relax knowing that I'm reliant on one company, right? So
I'm definitely with you on that. If the so-called mosaics law holds and we see 75% reduction in cost year over year for attaining the same benchmark levels, maybe there will be other players that come in with large open models that can support them, but we'll see. Um,
all right. So I guess that's your first one. So let me go
yeah,
to my second one, which is I think by the time this podcast comes out, I would have pushed out this newsletter on agents, right? So I don't know if I've been talking to you about this, Paco, but I mean, if you look at 2023, the word that people were throwing around in 2023 was co-pilots, right? So co-pilots are, you have LLM working alongside a human, right? This year, the word people are throwing out more often are agents, and agents, as you know, Paco, from computer science, tend to be more autonomous and semi-autonomous, right? So they ideally more autonomous, they can go perform a very specific task, right? So now, traditionally in the past, the kind of the canonical example for pitch decks was, let me book a complicated travel plan flight with multiple legs, right? So that's not what I'm talking about in this incarnation of the usage of the word agents. I think probably the more accurate way to describe what I'm talking about is more like robotic process automation 2.0, RPA
okay.
2.0. So
So
now you're talking about using one of these foundation models to maybe streamline a specific business process, right? So you're getting data from multiple sources, cross-referencing it, and then generating a report highlighting, you know, anomalies and things like that. Maybe you even automatically generate a chart, right? Or you can use it to combine multiple financial documents, right? So, and then maybe uh, do an audit and a financial report and things like that. So it's much more in line with what you would expect an RPA system to do, but now it's backed by one of these foundation models. So we're increasingly seeing more of that. And, it's a bit of a early stage, but there are some open source projects. So one that comes to mind is Crew AI, crewai.io, right? So it's an open source framework. But there are others. And I mean, it can get complicated, right? So you can have a single agent, but then there's also scenarios, Paco, where you have multiple agents working, right, together.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I joke actually the word of the year last year was co-pilots. This year there are two words, agents and multimodal, right? So anyway, so that's my spiel on agents. So agents are worth paying attention to, and read my newsletter, and I'll have a piece on agents on there by the time this comes out.
So to paraphrase that, then would that be less sort of the knowledge navigator video from, I don't know what, 30, 40 years ago, but less of that notion and more of like microservices that are really juiced up by, like you say, RPA, but then using LLMs to make them much, much more efficient and much more specialized.
Much more capable, right? But then I mean, it's still software, right? So you will need to do all your software stuff, right? So which means you will have to do things like I don't know, monitoring, right?
It, yeah,
Real time monitoring, activity logging.
the whole the
You
whole suite of MLOps really comes to the fore.
yeah. I think this is a lesson that we need to kind of really hammer home is that just because it's agents or just because it's generative AI, it's still AI and ML. So you still need to make sure you have your basics in place, your pipelines, your monitoring, your retraining, your QA process, right? So in the case of
Yeah.
so one question that has come up recently a lot for me at least, and in the context of LLMs, but I would suspect it will also come up in the context of agents, Paco, is when do I know I'm good enough to go when I can deploy, right? So let's set
Interesting.
aside. So
Okay.
there's a lot to answer in that question, but let's focus on
Sure.
one aspect, right? So quality. Well, it really depends on your use case and your tolerance for deviation from a predictable answer, right? So, I mean, so you can do a lot of uh, testing, right? So red teaming and testing, right? So you can test your LLM, fine-tune LLMs, but at some point, it really depends on the use case. If it's an internal use case where the users are inside your company, maybe your tolerance for a little going off the rails is higher, right? So, but if it's outward facing, like a chatbot facing customers, well, maybe that's a completely different ball of wax. Maybe you will have to do some of the more advanced alignment techniques that Paco was alluding to, like RLHF or some of the newer techniques, right? But and same thing with agents, right? So if the agent is tasked with generating reports, you can do all of the normal testing and QA steps that you would do, and then at some point you have to decide. I'm saving a lot of hours that a human being can do, and I'm saving this much money. But human beings make mistakes, agents will make mistakes. So, you will have to determine what's your level of tolerance for such mistakes, right? So, I don't
Yeah,
know.
where do you get the benefits?
Do
Yeah.
you have any other specific advice in terms of when to pull the trigger on these things?
Oh, I saw an excellent graph on this recently. I'll try to dig up the source and link it. But the idea is, yeah, I mean, you could have people doing a task, you could have machines doing a task. At some point, the cost versus the accuracy and performance, that curve comes down to where probably more machine or maybe some mix of it. because you keep retraining and keep having the feedback from the human side. So I think it's probably best to start out with this idea that you will end up having a mix of people and machines, probably more people to start out with. But it also comes back to the thing that we've been saying for a long time is like you really want to focus on a narrowly defined task because these are the things your business, your organization understands, and then you can have better benchmark eval, et cetera, better ways of determining is it ready for production. Keep that narrow focus.
So, what about the broader topic? Since you're an old school CS person,
Well, yeah,
hearing the word agents come back.
yeah, no, near and dear to my heart. So a couple things come to mind. I mean, one is just like the learnings that we've had in machine learning over the decades. The first thing that strikes me is the notion of like the Netflix prize and what came out of that the first year and second year. Um, even though there's really only one prize, but it was the idea of ensembles. And I mean, at first, the idea of like, let's just not have a model which magically kills every other model. Instead, we use a lot of them, maybe, 1,000 of them together to try to solve a problem and catch all the edge cases.
The
And then
mixture of experts.
yeah, and then we
Right.
saw ensembles of teams using ensembles. We
Yeah.
saw ensembles of ensembles in the Netflix press. Exactly. I think this cuts to mixture of experts. I think it also cuts to the ideas of like topologies of agents. Are we doing, decomposing a complicated task into, chain of thoughts or tree of thoughts or graph of thoughts or whatever, but we can start to use some software engineering approaches to understand the trade-offs of wow, now we've got a graph of like, a dozen different agents that we can apply in this problem. What do we really need in the mix? Where are some that are more expensive, but they give us good results as opposed to some that are much more cost effective. Yeah, I think it
Which
becomes
I
a
think
software architecture problem.
exactly. So I was just going to say. So what you're saying is, at some point, you start out building an agent or two, and you probably realize, hey, I probably will need some sort of platform where I can be much more formal, where I can be much more formal, where I can test.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So some of these experiments might require scale and distributed computation because you want to. But basically, I think. But on the other hand, I think you should probably go and try these things out rather than being held back by the fact that, hey, I don't have a platform team, I don't have an internal platform. No, you should just go try. There are probably some tasks in-house, right? So I mean, it goes back to the basics in the big data world, right, Paco? Which is basically, first of all, do I have the scale to justify automation, right? So
Yeah,
do
yeah,
I have the data that will help me get to automation, right? So
yeah.
so if
And
if
and
if,
and
if
and do I
you're
have the team to manage it also in
if
production?
if the task is done once a quarter and only requires 2 hours of a person, well, I don't know. Maybe
Yeah.
that's not a high priority task, right? But there might be tasks that are so tedious and that will let you. By the way, so this means by automating some of these tasks, this means some of your domain experts are free to do much more high value things, probably, right? So
Yeah,
rather
I,
than
I,
these things that can be, if it can be automated, they probably shouldn't be doing it anyway, right? So
yeah, that should be lived across an organization. Yeah, definitely.
so
Um,
so, so it's so am I on to something here? Are you also hearing this word?
I am across the board. I think multimodal and agents are the top two words. The other thing, of course, is just data engineering. Having your data in shape, having the availability and the data quality is very key. Whether your focus is going to be on evals because you're just using everything off the shelf, or whether you're doing some sort of fine tuning, like we were talking about our LHF alternatives, like SFT and DPO and whatnot. Or if you're just, using a knowledge graph and using RAG, but at some point you're going to be putting data to bear on the problem, so you need to have your ducks in a row there.
All right. So on to Paco. And Paco, I'm going to steer you to the topic I want you to talk about, which is
Yeah.
Doug.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was going to pick
Right.
next. So, Yeah, my graduate advisor, Douglas Lenat, unfortunately passed away a bit ago here, and we wanted to make a few notes in memoriam. Um, when you look at what Doug had done with his dissertation called AM, Advanced Mathematics, and then his postdoc work was something called Eurisco. I met Doug, I guess, in like summer of '82. He was teaching. One of the first courses I took at Stanford was Intro to AI, which is a course that Andrew Ng picked up years and years later and made it famous as a MOOC. But Doug was teaching a grad level course on that, and then some natural language courses and whatnot. And so I ended up being getting into his program, becoming one of his grad students, one of his TAs, and got to work with him. And then later on, he left the university and went to Austin and worked on built up a project called Psych. Um, so I guess to characterize it, early on, he had been looking at generative methods in AI. He'd been looking at machine learning. The AM project, his dissertation had a lot of controversy because he claimed that, you could show a through line from where it started with set theory and then was able to develop proofs for instance, one of the things that it developed proof for was maximally divisible numbers, sort of the opposite of prime numbers. And at the time that his dissertation came out, there was another math PhD being granted over in India that he didn't know about, but it was about maximally divisible numbers. So you could argue there was some fairly original work that was robust that AM was doing, although he got a lot of criticism for that. Eurisco similarly was literally doing generative approaches using frame representation and machine learning, and came out with some wild generative AI approaches like the Traveler science fiction competition, where Doug went in, fed in the rules, generated a fleet, wiped out every other fleet in the competition. They
So
changed the rules.
he's known for knowledge base and expert systems. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, no, I would say not. At the time, expert systems were like the big thing in AI back in the '80s, early '80s, and this is prior to like fifth generation and the AI winter. Yeah, no, everybody was talking expert systems, and Doug was saying, well, we can do a lot with like feeding data into machine learning instead. So there's sort of this trade-off between like statistical learning systems versus symbolic systems that are very hands-on. Everybody at the time was talking about expert systems and very hands-on, and that only went so far. Doug was saying, look, we can take a lot of data, feed it in, and have machine learning basically come up with ways to generate things that are useful for us. And this was applied in fields like circuit design. Very interesting work coming out of it. Unfortunately, at the time in like 1985, the professors at Stanford CSD said that Doug's work was too empirical, that machine learning was not rigorous enough. And so instead of getting tenure there, he went and did psych and shifted from instead of doing these kinds of inferential systems, he was focusing on we really need a big corpus of like common sense reasoning. And so psych was all about trying to put together common sense reasoning and just massive data sets
And so
for
what is
benchmark as well as training.
so is psych, what is the status of psych? Is it open?
There is the upper ontology, there's something called OpenPsych. And I got to use this later on. There was a very well-known security firm back in the oh gosh, early aughts that approached me. They wanted to use Psych, do a generative approach to network security recommendations. And so I led a team out of Psych, three engineers at our startup as a subcontractor. And yeah, so there are parts that were very proprietary, there were parts that were very open. And so the upper part of it is more of the general categories, and that gets used for helping to train or being a basis for other
So
knowledge graph work.
so psych is a knowledge graph?
In a way, I mean, there's essentially a lot of connected data that can be used for inference about common sense reasoning about problems. And the idea, Doug, I mean, the thesis early on was like, if you just put enough common sense reasoning together, you can come out with really amazing inference. It's not far off the mark of saying, let's take 3 trillion tokens that from what we scraped off the web and train an LLM and then do some sort of general purpose reasoning off of it. Gosh, that sounds familiar. So, yeah, I think Doug was really leading the way. It was far too early. We didn't have the compute yet for a lot of this. So I
But
think the
the
goals were pretty
difference
lofty.
the difference in psych is everything in there is inputted by a human.
Well, it's been inputted by a team of about 40 to 50 different humans over a period of multiple decades.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
so
so
if so this is speculation, right? So you take the
yeah.
entire psych, you make it available to Google or OpenAI, would their systems improve?
I mean, I think there's an argument that you could be doing some jurist or training, basically using one model to teach another model. I think there's a lot of room for that. I will say that, I mean, Psych had hallucination problems. That was one of the things we were grappling with back with network security 25 years
Really?
ago.
I mean,
Yeah.
inputted, yeah, I guess humans can make mistakes, right? So,
Well, the thing is, the thing is, if you have millions and millions of rules that humans have put in, that's not too far off the mark of like, trillions of tokens that are basically assembled together in stochastic
yeah, yeah,
patterns.
yeah.
It's kind of the same thing.
Wow.
It's just that one is a lot more expensive than the other. But yeah, they both tend toward hallucination because they're not necessarily grounded and they're doing something generative, which means, just make something up and see if it sticks.
So what is the interface for psych? Is it RDF?
There was a chat-based interface is what we were
Oh,
using back then.
really?
At one point, I had all of Psych on my laptop, or at least most all of Psych at the time. I had it on my laptop in about 2004. And so there's a chat interface, but then there's also a programmatic interface as well.
And so what's
Um,
gonna happen to psych?
oh, it's been going on. I mean,
No, no, now that Doug has passed away.
I don't know exactly what's going on with the company. I know that there are other people who are very much leaders in that area who've been, I look forward to actually catching up. We're going to have some discussions about this in the Knowledge Graph conference in New York
Yeah.
in New York City next week. But I know that like Michael Whitbrock and others, I mean, there are others who are very much principals in this. And I think a lot of these efforts have a long road ahead because we are seeing a real uptick in interest of using knowledge graphs to help ground the facts that are being used in an LLM through RAG. And, upper psychontology was very formulative. It had a lot of influence on many projects, including, I mean, it definitely influenced a lot of the early notions of, semantic web. So, I think that we will see a lot of hybrid systems going forward. We see this now with RAG being put in to help ground what's going on with LLMs. So, part is just massive data sets, training models. Part of it is something that's more curated, and between the two, you get a hybrid approach. And I think that Psych definitely led the way and still has a lot of room to help inform on this.
So do you think that psych itself, the data inside psych is still valuable?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that, well, let me put it this way. We were just talking about Meta. We don't know exactly what data sets they're using. There's a lot. There's these benchmarks, MMLU,
Well,
et cetera,
this
that
is
people use.
decades of people putting in rules in there. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah, here's something that's more explicit than just like, here's a massive benchmark.
uh,
I think there's a value there to try to, I think eventually we will tease out, and I'll bring this up later in the discussion, but benchmarks are problematic because you're kind of measuring for a small set of benefits through something that's kind of canned, and you come out with a number. Um, a benchmark is problematic, and throwing a lot of benchmarks at a model, okay, maybe get a better view, but I think we're going to see more and more of these kind of evaluations being teased out with ways that end up looking more like psych. You're mentioning before, an organization needs to understand when is a model ready to put in production. And if you have a narrow focus and you can define what that task is supposed to do, Now you've got a good way to evaluate. Okay, well that's kind of where psych was doing 40 years ago. So I think that we'll see at least this approach being adopted more and more in enterprise, as people move away from just, I'm going to use a foundation model off the shelf with XYZ benchmark and we're done.
So the data itself is not that big according to you, right? So
Oh, no, it's
in
pretty
the
big.
so in
I have a
the
large laptop.
so in the language of knowledge or graphs and knowledge graphs, you know how graph people always talk about, I have a billion vertices and a trillion edges. So how would you characterize psych using
Oh,
kind of describe it in those terms, in term size?
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, early on, I mean, we were talking about tens of thousands, right?
Mhm,
And this is what started back in the 80s.
mhm.
So let me see if I can get some numbers off of yeah, OpenStack 4.0 had a 250,000 concepts and 2 million facts. And so you can think of a concept as, well, yeah, let's just leave it at that. It's not
Yeah,
exactly
yeah.
edges and nodes, but okay, so you've got a fairly good graph, but again, that's something I could run in a graph on my laptop. And then if you look at research psych, these are numbers from, well, 7 years ago.
So
Eh,
Doug himself, Paco, spent uh, uh, many years putting this together, but he was also using it to do consulting, is what you're describing. That's
yeah, I mean
there's gotta be a way for them to make revenue in order to have survived that long, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there were a lot of applications they were working on in terms of DoD. I mean, that was a lot of the funding was more DoD focused. Definitely, Apple, IBM, et cetera. You can go down the list, but most all the tech majors made their way through to evaluating, doing POCs, and I think a lot of it helped inform strategy that now, I mean, we're talking about strategies from Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, etc. And so I could help inform some of their thinking even 2 decades ago. So yeah, it's definitely had its mark. I don't know where the company is at currently. I'll have to look that up. And but like I say, OpenStack is available and it does inform a lot of research.
All right.
Um,
So we each get one quickie and then a
yeah.
recommendation. All right. So
Okay.
my
Great.
quickie is TikTok. I wrote a piece. Basically, I was just thinking through, right? So, uh, what does this kind of development around TikTok mean? And I can understand both sides of the argument in terms of, I mean, I think people are raising all sorts of national security concerns around uh, uh, foreign company that's essentially a media company, right? So we do have rules around media ownership, right? Like if you're not a U.S. citizen, how many TV stations can you own and things like that. So I can
Yeah.
understand all of that. But then on the other hand, it seems like they just kind of moved ahead and did this without. It's like a one-off kind of. What's the overarching principle?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're foreign, and you should just say that, right? So this is the rule. If you're a social media company in the US and you are mostly foreign owned, then you have to do certain things. I guess I was just grappling with what's the overarching principle behind the ban. I guess there's none. It's just a
Yeah.
one-off kind of thing. So, and what about you? What's your quickie?
My quickie is from Princeton, the AI snake oil group. They had a really good article recently saying that, leaderboards maybe aren't quite as useful as we've over-indexed on them. And instead, we should be looking at things like Pareto curves and doing multiple metrics. So basically, if you're evaluating models and you're not including the cost, well, there's one thing. But in a lot of ways, this really has bearing on, like we were talking about with agents, that you want to understand what are the trade-offs between different ones that you mix together. So I'm a big fan of Pareto curves, and I've done some open source in those lines for approximating hypervolumes, and it's really useful technique when you have machine learning results but want to sort of rebalance ensembles. Um, so I definitely recommend that link from, let's see, the authors on that. I'll give credit to Sayesh Kapoor and Arvind Nayaman.
So I think the Unify.ai folks, they don't have a Pareto curve, but they have multiple dimensions around cost, latency,
E- Exactly, yeah,
and things like that. So now, as far as leaderboards, what I tell people is, I mean, when a new LLM gets released, myself and many people I know, the process is the following, right? So you look at the release notes, you read it, you look at the license, you read it. And then if it's on the leaderboard, you look at its position. But you know what? At the end of the day, there's no substitute for trying it on your data, on your use case. So,
very true, very true.
so
Yeah,
whatever leaderboard there is can be gamed anyway, So, to some extent, maybe not the chatbot arena, but whatever benchmarks they say they topped when they released the thing and they put out
sure.
their blog post, they may have over indexed or over optimized for that benchmark anyway. So there's no substitute. You gotta try it. Machine learning is an empirical discipline. It's trial and error. You gotta learn from uh, using it yourself, right? So, but what
Eh,
the leaderboard does do is it says, hey, instead of looking at 30 things, I can look at three things. So, or three or four things, and then try those things.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
does focus some priorities and attention. Also, when we say Pareto curve,
Yeah.
that's a large word. 3 lines of Python using NumPy, and you can take something like Unify that has multiple columns, multiple dimensions, and create an aggregate Pareto curve out of it. So it's something that's simple to do in Python if you need to.
All right. So then my recommendation this time is a site called ethics.dev. I don't know
Cool.
how to describe it, but it's basically just uh, you know, a bunch of stories around the intersection of technology and societal concerns, ethics. So a lot of it is AI and ML related, and it just changes regularly. So, what about you? What do you have any specific recommendation?
Yeah, okay. Mea culpa, forgive me. I'm going to recommend a tutorial that I've been working on
Oh,
with,
awesome! Yeah, yeah, awesome.
yeah, so this is a project where friends who lead some companies, Senzing and Neo4j. So this is where our friend Jeff Jonas at Senzing and Philip Rathley at Neo4j we're looking at ways that they could partner. And so they came to us and said, hey, let's do a demo. Let's show integration. And what we did was to take open data. Well, also we partner with SafeGraph. So we use the SafeGraph data. But then we use open data from different federal agencies, and we look at businesses in the Las Vegas area. And so we use entity resolution to clean up the data quality because there's a lot of mismatches between like names of businesses and addresses and whatnot. So if you do the entity resolution first, then knowledge graph construction from that data is very straightforward. And so we've got a tutorial. Spend an hour or so playing with this. There's notebooks on GitHub that show how to do everything. I'll be teaching a tutorial on this at KGC, which we're recording now. KGC will be a week from now. It'll be 2 weeks after this comes out. But also, when this comes out, I'll be at the Data-Centric Architecture Forum doing a demo about it too, and some other places. So the bottom line there is you really need to have your data quality if you're going to leverage a graph in like RAG for LLMs. If you don't have the data quality, it can lead to a lot of problems, and typically open data or data you get from a third party has this. Sensing is a really great way. There's open source. You can leverage in Python very readily or C++. And so we put together a tutorial. Check it out.
Yeah, yeah, and this ties back to one of the themes that we've been talking about here, which is basically, uh, you know, we might be in the age of generative AI, but make sure you got your fundamentals in place, right? So your data pipelines, your data quality, everything. It's still AI and ML. So, and I echo Paco's tutorial. It's great. And it also ties together some of these themes that you've been hearing us talk about, which is RAG, graph RAG, and data-centric AI.
Yep.
Yeah.
Very much so.
And with that, thank you again, Paco, and we'll talk to you again in a month.
Thank you, Ben.